Hello and welcome to the France 24 debate. Today, as Antonio Guterres formally gets the backing of the UN Security Council to become the next head of the United Nations, we'll be asking, is he the right man for the job? Should it be a man in the job at all? Isn't it time for a woman to take the helm? And going beyond all that, is the UN head's mission now impossible, given the situation in Syria and the deep divisions between the US and Russia, among other problems? Overall, does the UN still have a meaningful role in today's world? Well, joining me to discuss all that now, I can introduce you to some of the members of our panel. Here with me in the France 24 studio in Paris, I've got Yves Doutrieux, a former UN man yourself. You were France's deputy permanent representative to the UN from 1998 to 2002. Now we're at the Council of State, a very experienced diplomat. Thank you very much for being with us here on the France 24 debate. Also joining us from Washington, we have Dov Zakheim, the former US Undersecretary of Defense and Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to George W. Bush. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us as well. Before we introduce, you're very welcome. Before we introduce the two remaining members of our panel, we are going to just take a very quick look at Antonio Guterres, the man poised to become the new UN head, and take a look at his career so far.
A new chapter for Antonio Guterres, but the political veteran won't be heading into uncharted territory. A trained engineer, Guterres first entered politics in 1976, in Portugal's first ever democratic election. Rising through the ranks, he became the leader of the Socialist Party in 1992 and Prime Minister 3 years later, a position he held for 7 years. During his time leading the Portuguese government, Guterres was involved in handling a series of international crises. He oversaw the independence process in East Timor, a former Portuguese colony occupied by Indonesia, and the transfer of sovereignty from Macau to China in the 90s. Guterres also strongly advocated for Portugal to join the Eurozone. To this day, his administration remains the only minority government in the country's modern history to last a full 4-year term. Guterres was named United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in 2005, a position he occupied until 2015. During his time there, he repeatedly called on Western nations to do more to help those fleeing war and conflict.
We have 290,000 people that came to Europe by sea. If you compare with the population of the European Union, 508 million people, it is perfectly manageable.
Guterres said his time at UNHCR was both a privilege and a, quote, terrible frustration due to his inability to completely solve the refugee crisis.
All right, let's get started with the France 24 debate. I'm going to ask you, Yves Doutrieux, France's former deputy permanent representative at the UN. Do you feel that Antonio Guterres is the right choice to become the new Secretary General?
I'm sure he will be a very good Secretary General. He has a lot of experience with the UN, being the General Director of the HCR. Which is a very prominent agency confronted with the migration crisis from the Middle East, in Africa, and many other regions in the world. So it's clear that he's a man of experience, not to speak about his experience as former Prime Minister of Portugal. So I'm sure that my country will be delighted to cooperate with him.
Do you think it's a European victory of sorts?
I won't say that in theory, but it's pure theory because it's not in the UN Charter. There is a kind of geographical distribution. It was Africa, later on Asia with Ban Ki-moon, Africa with Kofi Annan and Boutros Ghali before. And before it was Latin America with Pérez de Cuéllar. And this time we're expecting Eastern Europe. And there were many candidates from Eastern Europe. But at the end of the day, it's somebody from Western Europe. But I just wonder if what's the meaning of Eastern Europe versus Western Europe, whereas most of European states today are part of the European Union?
Yeah, that's a question. We'll get into the impact, the geopolitical impact of this nomination a little later on. I want to bring in now Professor Rosa Friedman, Professor of Law and Global Development at the University of Reading in the UK. She can join us now. Rosa Friedman, what do you think of this nomination? Are you satisfied?
Absolutely not satisfied. I think obviously the candidate who's now the Secretary General is a credible candidate, but it's simply not good enough to have an opaque, lack of transparent process, to have yet another man, a white, middle-aged man from Western Europe, take up the top seat in an organisation that is supposed to be about we the peoples, but has never represented half the peoples, women, in this world.
I mean, as we were just hearing, he is incredibly qualified. He's the former head of the UN High Commission for Refugees. And given the current context with the Syrian refugee crisis, notably, surely that's got to be in his favour, despite the fact that he's not a woman.
Look, he is highly qualified. Every candidate that stood for this post was highly qualified. And there are very many other highly qualified people out there. What he has is the cultural capital, the networks, having risen up through the ranks, first as Prime Minister of Portugal, also as head of the refugee agency. He has the networks available to him to ensure that he was successful. Was he the best possible candidate out there? Absolutely not. Maybe he was the best one on that slate, although there are many other candidates on that slate who had held similarly prominent and important positions. But the bottom line is we have once again a Western European who can placate all 5 of the permanent members and who has networked well with what many people describe as a very affable and amiable personality in order to take the top job. But let's be clear about this. This at no point was a meritocracy. From day one, there's no criteria, there's no transparent process, so we will never know who the best candidate would have been.
Given all your objections there, do you think that is actually going to damage the credibility now going forward of his role?
Absolutely. I think the credibility of the United Nations was damaged with the appointment of the last Secretary General, which was a very clear compromise between the United States and China. And I think the credibility now, from watching the reactions from around the world, from beyond Europe, the reactions have been one of, yet again, the United Nations not simply not representing women, but not representing a geographic region, even though there is a law within the UN Charter that it's supposed to represent all geographic regions, and that yet again it has taken someone who is an insider with that cultural capital rather than opening up access and widening barriers, which the United Nations seeks to do in every other context outside of the organisation, but never seems to do within the organisation.
Well, let's go outside of Europe now ourselves in this debate, and we can go to Washington and speak to Dov Zakheim, the former US Undersecretary of Defense. I want to ask you, sir, whether you think that Antonio Guterres is up to this job, whether you think anyone is up to this job, in fact.
Well, I think he is. Look, I don't think the issue is really one of a man or a woman. If you look, one of the permanent members of the Security Council is now being led by a woman, Great Britain. For all we know, in about 6 weeks' time, another powerful member of the Security Council, namely my country, may be led by a woman. I don't think that's the issue at all. I think the real issue is whether any Secretary General will have the kind of influence that's needed to close this growing gap between Russia and the West on the one hand, and between China and the West on the other. That's the real issue. Guterres has the experience. He has the network, as we've heard. He knows the United Nations. Whether he can pull it off or not, I don't know. He admitted himself how frustrated he's been over the previous 10 years when he was High Commissioner for Refugees. He's going to be very frustrated in this job as well. But man or woman, I don't think that's the issue.
OK, let me put that point back to our previous guest, who clearly completely disagrees with you. Rosa Friedman there at the University of Reading. It doesn't matter whether it's a man or a woman. The UN is at loggerheads anyway.
The UN is at loggerheads in many ways, particularly within the Security Council. The structure of the Security Council clearly needs reform. The power dynamics between the permanent 5 members seeks to cripple the United Nations when it's trying to intervene in Syria, when it's trying to intervene in Yemen, when it's trying to do good work in the world. But the bottom line is, of course it matters whether it's a man or a woman. Of course it matters to 50% of this world who are women, who look up to people like Helen Clark, who look up to people like Hillary Clinton as the pioneers. The fact that we are in the 21st century and we're still looking for pioneers, and it's not just the Secretary General's position, it's all of the top echelons of the United Nations. It's very infrequent, it's very rare for women to be appointed at the upper echelons. Even though Ban Ki-moon pledged to have gender parity at those levels, he never managed to do so. And even though the new Secretary General has already said he will appoint women, we know that his priority now will be to appoint Russians, because there have been deals made behind the scenes, and to appoint the many other people of nationality over gender. It's simply not good enough.
All right, I want to get on to some of these backroom dealings now. Yves Dutrieu, what do you think Antonio Guterres would have had to promise to Russia, perhaps to China as well, in order to secure this post? It's not a very transparent process, even though perhaps it's opened up a little more this time round, but there's a lot of backroom dealing going on surely here.
I would say that for the first time it has been more open than in the past. I agree that it could be more transparent. But this time there were panels, open panels, where each candidate, woman or man, could introduce themselves and respond to questions, and not only from Security Council members, but as well from other countries.
Sure,
so it has been more open, more transparent. Further progress could be done.
But this is the world of diplomacy, and we know a lot of this is about relations behind the scenes that we won't even see in these panels. I mean, what do you think he's had to say to the Russians particularly to get them on board?
He will have to deal, as we have to deal, as Russia and America and Europe, we have to deal with crisis. And in crisis time, you have to speak to everybody, all those who have a hand on a specific issues like Syria. It's obvious that we cannot break a peace in Syria without the consent of Russia. And the Secretary General will have to work for that. Today, the French Foreign Affairs Minister is in Moscow. I understand that he will be in Washington very soon in order to try to broker something between the two superpowers, those who are most present today in Syria. And obviously, the job of the Secretary General, which is the most difficult job in the world, is to try to broker, to be in contact with all the parties, not only superpower, as we refer to, but with regional powers. Speaking about Syria, you have Iran, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Turkey, and some others. In most of African crises, South Sudan and so on, you have regional, Burundi, Congo. And it's the most difficult job in the world. And in addition, he has to be the chief operator of the UN families. And it's so you see the two faces of the job, being a diplomat, a politician on the one hand, and a good manager on the other hand.
Well, let's put these questions now. Someone who's just joining us on the debate. We've got Pedro Mota Suarez from Lisbon for us. He knows Antonio Guterres very well indeed. Obviously, former Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Guterres. Pedro Mota Suarez is a member of Parliament for the CDS-PP, the Christian Democratic People's Party. Good evening to you, sir. Now, you have seen Antonio Guterres an awful lot. You worked alongside him on the migration crisis in 2015. Do you think he is up for the most difficult job in the world? Do you think he can do it?
Well, if it's not the most difficult job in the world, it's probably one of the most. But to tell you, to be honest, I think he is willing and he's going to really change things. We are not talking about your typical politician. This is not a politician, the type of politician that you're used to. It's not a house of cards politician. It's someone with a very strong social conscience. And he's been doing it in politics and outside politics. Well, it's very curious to read about, and I think there's at least one book about Antonio Guterres, just to read about what he did when he was a young student in college. He's someone who is very, very involved with communities. And I think that's why, to be honest, he was probably, at the end of his mandate, not the happiest prime minister of Europe. But probably when he went to ACNUR to work with refugees, he was probably the most satisfied with himself and the most happy UN worker, because he really thought that he could change things. And I think that what he did in ACNUR really tells us a lot about the figure of Antonio Guterres. And that's why I think that he's really willing in making his mark and making a change as Secretary General of UN.
So he's got the vision, perhaps, he's got perhaps moral authority, some would argue, but can anyone do it, even with those attributes? Isn't the UN just completely gridlocked here?
Well, that's the $1 million question. Of course, it does not just depend on the Secretary General of the UN. We have to understand how the UN works. And the Secretary General is not the chairman or the CEO of UN, but is very important. And I really think that it can make a difference. I think that if you really will look at what he did in his work with refugees in ACNUR, if you see what he did there and the changes that he did there, mainly changes linked to things like reducing some of the costs, not reducing the budget, in order to make so much more work with actual refugees, is a very good visit card to what he plans to do next. And mainly, he is a person that is always trying to build bridges. I think that's one of the most well-known figures of Antonio Guterres.
Okay.
When he ran for prime minister of Portugal.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We are going to.
The word that he was saying, he was pushing was dialogue. He was willing to put people with different views in the same bridge, trying to build bridges between them. And that's why I think that's what really marked his mandate as Secretary General.
Okay,
bringing together, trying to build those bridges.
Mr. Suarez, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're going to take a very quick break here, actually, just to get the news headlines. When we come back to the second half of the France 24 debate, we're going to get into these really meaty questions. Can anyone be a successful head of the UN? And does the UN have a role in 2016? Stay tuned.